All right, welcome everyone. I think we're going to get started tonight with our May Neighborhood Health Series. This is the last event before we take our break this summer and resume on the fall month. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you to Clark County Credit Union, to Craig Fraley, who will speak in a moment. Thank you so much for your partnership, an incredible community partner that's doing great work in our community. And thank you so much for your support of the series. We couldn't really do it without you. I also would like to thank our ASL interpreters that are here tonight with us that'll begin interpreting shortly. And just kind of moving into some of the logistical things, as you can probably see, I am recording our session. And after the session, I will post it on the Neighborhood Health Series website. So that's speakers.roseman.edu. So you can find that there and also share it with anyone else. As I mentioned, we'll go into our hiatus after this month and we'll be back in September. We've got 4 great events coming up in the fall into the winter, and all of 2022 is planned. So we look forward to sharing with you a whole new lineup of content. All right, just quick overview about our Neighborhood Health Series. We've been doing this for about 6 years. And when I look back on the past 6 years, I'm incredibly proud of all the topics that we've covered. It's really just a really special and unique opportunity for our faculty, our students, we have prospective students, we have community members to come together and share stories and share really insights on health and wellness. So I have gotten so much out of this series, and I'm always happy to see our return guests come back, because obviously that means they're getting a lot out of it as well. So with that, I'd like to move into introducing our very special guest tonight. Dr. Geralyn Crain received her undergraduate degree from the University of California in San Diego, her dental degree from the University of Washington, and an interdisciplinary PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, where she studied organizational development and change in dental education. Before coming to Roseman, Dr. Crain held the positions of Assistant Dean for Educational Support and Faculty Development, and Interim Assistant Vice Chancellor for Interprofessional Collaboration at East Carolina University. Dr. Crain is a member of the American Dental Association, the American Interprofessional Health Collaborative, has recently been nominated as a Fellow of the National Academies of Practice. To honor her mother's legacy, Dr. Crain remains an active member of the Speakers Bureau in the states where she has lived, including the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education and the North Carolina Commission on the Holocaust. I'm incredibly grateful to Dr. Crain for sharing this intimate story of courage and hope with us tonight that truly transcends place and time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerry Crain.
Vanessa, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to share my mother's story tonight. And thank you to everyone who's joining tonight at the end of a busy day, or if you're viewing this on the recording. Thank you so much for your time and your interest in this topic. Before I dive in, I did want to turn it over to Craig from the Clark County Credit Union. Craig, if you wanted to say a few words.
Thank you, Doctor. Clark County Credit Union is very proud to be a sponsor of Roseman's Neighborhood Health Series. If you ever need any help financially, we do everything that a bank does, but we are owned by our members. We are not for profit. And at the end of the year, we give our profits back to our members. Since the year 2000, our 47,000 members have shared over $68 million back into their accounts. And you can reach us at cccu.lv.org, or you can reach us by phone, and you can open your account on the phone or on our website. Everybody have a wonderful evening. Enjoy tonight's presentation, and I'll send it back over to you, Doctor. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Before I dive in, I just wanted to bring a few things to your attention And as I tell my mother's story, if you listen for these few things, listen for how these things affected my mother, but also how they might fit into your life today. I'm just amazed at how relevant my mom's story is through the years. One of the things is resilience during crisis. If there's anyone among us who doesn't think that the past year was a crisis, either personally for yourself or for others, that would be surprising. I think we all have lived through crisis. You'll hear some bits about how my mother experienced resilience during crisis and living through social injustice and discrimination. Again, if you yourself haven't experienced social injustice or discrimination, but you know someone who has, or if you've seen on the news, watching TV, etc., these are topics that are still relevant today. And then also changing the world through education. I think we are all educators in some way, whether you are a parent, whether you are a student, you are an educator through your example and through the conversations you have with your friends and others, certainly as educators in the classroom or the clinic. My mother was an educator extraordinaire in the way that she told her story as well. Also, listen for these things. The underlying misinformation about human populations that helped bring upon the Holocaust, and those health professions that actually actively participated in the beginning of this. Listen to for connection to our current day human subjects research protections that came from this time. Anyone who does research associated with the university knows about city training. It really stems from these early experiments on humans that I'll just touch upon. And most important, what can happen if discrimination is left unchecked? Just a few thoughts about the word Holocaust itself. According to Webster, it's a thorough destruction of loss, especially through fire, when you hear the term Holocaust. Also can mean a mass slaughter of people or a genocide. For example, the Holocaust in Rwanda or the Armenian genocide. These are examples of Holocaust. But when we say the Holocaust, or when it's capitalized, that refers specifically to the mass murders of European civilians, especially Jews, by the Nazis during World War II. So my mother was a Holocaust survivor. So just a few words of definitions. Now, I am not a historian, and my mother used to say this as well when she spoke to schools and churches and book clubs and all kinds of venues. She always made it very clear she is not a historian, but she had a story to share. And I'm sharing her story. I'm not a historian, but I just wanted to put her story into perspective a little. So we know that World War I grew from the devastating loss that Germany experienced during World War II. My son is just studying this right now in middle school, and they have concluded with the Treaty of Versailles, the end of World War I, which really left Germany humiliated and in a position of suffering themselves, having to build back after losing the war. So it was within this political, economic, social context that World War II was beginning to percolate. Oops. And, but what happened was, as these sentiments were growing and Germany was trying to build back, there was a person who came on the political scene by the name of Adolf Hitler. And my father, who I won't mention too much, a little bit near the end of the talk, my father was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so he remembered the fall of Germany after World War I, and then the rise of Hitler coming on the scene. And Hitler was very charismatic and emphatic. And maybe you've seen some of the newsreels, but he would say things like, make Germany great again. And my dad said, yeah, we do. We need to make Germany great again. And so I would vote for him. And this was the growing sentiment. My dad, of course, was Jewish, but at first it was more of a national pride that was percolating. But in time, there were signs, and it's through the lens of history that we look back and we see that the Holocaust, which was part of World War II, was really, it became a systematic government-sponsored first persecution and then murder of a large number of people, 6 million Jews, but there were also others that were targeted. And here's a list of some of the other populations that were targeted. So how did this begin, this systematic government-sponsored persecution and then ultimate murder? So the persecution started in this environment during the 30s, and this was a growing movement in various countries, and it was called eugenics. And it was almost like a precursor to our current day genetic study of genetics. But there was this idea that people were different because of their what kind of blood they had, what kind of genes they had. And so at first, disabled, first it was started out with targeting babies, and nurses and doctors and people who worked with disabled people were instructed, because these new policies were coming out, to identify who are the babies who are born with visible disabilities. And in time, they were taken to homes, places where they were told they would be rehabilitated. But what we know through the historical lens looking back is that they were often taken, but not ever heard from again. And this happened over a matter of years, but it was a very intentional cleansing of the genetic pool. So also homosexuals, Blacks, Jehovah's Witness, the Gypsy populations, which are now referred to as Sinti and Roma population. Certainly in time, people, now I'm jumping ahead because again, I'm not a historian, but I'm laying the field here for my mother's story. Political people who didn't agree with Adolf Hitler, or didn't agree with the people who followed him. If you didn't agree, you were sometimes you were targeted, and then later in the process, your own life was actually at risk. This went on to the point where once the killing mechanisms were first started and tried out on the disabled, on other targeted populations, then what's called the final solution, and that was when there was a very deliberate decision to construct the concentration camps and the 6 killing camps, the ones that had mechanisms for mass genocide, mass murder. That's when my mother was swept into this enormous tragedy. And sometimes I have trouble just thinking of the enormity of the loss. I'll be honest with you, in watching the COVID numbers rise rise and now fall, thankfully, it was hard to wrap your head around the numbers of people and the numbers of death that we're talking about. And in terms of the Jewish people who were murdered during the Holocaust, we know that the number was 6 million. I once heard a math teacher when I was involved, as I am with Holocaust education, a math teacher in middle school worked this out. And I did the math here. So if you take 1 second to represent one person who died, and if there's 60 seconds per minute and there's 60 minutes in an hour, if you do the math, there's 3,600 seconds in an hour. And in one day, that makes 86,400 seconds in a day. And if you were to say 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000 for the number of seconds, and each second represents a person who died, it would take you saying that 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000 around the clock, nonstop, every second of every day for, I did the math, 69.44 days. So a little over 2 months in order to say the names of, or to represent the number of Jews who died during the Holocaust. And going back to that previous box, you double that number for the number who were killed during the Holocaust. Another way to put this in terms of numbers is the population of Nevada is about 3.8 million. The population of Utah, about 3.2 million. Add them together, it's about the number, it's about a little over 6 million. And if you double that, that's the number of people who died during the Holocaust. So my mother, Alice Kern, she wrote a book about her memories. She didn't talk about it a whole lot when I was growing up. I have 3 older sisters, and she didn't talk about it a whole lot. I knew, but didn't really go into a lot of details. She was just mom. And we were just, girls doing our thing growing up in Portland, Oregon. And it wasn't until I was in dental school when my mother published her book. And what happened was she had a tattoo on her arm, and she was at a luncheon, and she happened to sit next to a priest. And the priest saw her tattoo and said, "Alice, can you tell me what it was like inside the concentration camp?" And she said, "Well, I can't really talk about it, but if you're interested, I wrote down my memories." And he said, "Sure, I'd love to read them." And she used to carry a stack of papers. First, she started out handwriting. Later, she switched to typing them. And I remember this when she would take me to my ballet lessons or music lessons. The other moms would come in, she'd stay in the car and she would write. Later, she was typing on the typewriter at home. But she ended up with a stack of papers. It was her memories. The priest, took those papers and read them. And in about a week, he called her and he said, "Alice, I'm a priest, but I'm also a publisher, and I'm going to publish a book for you." And that's how we got the book. She never intended to write a book. She was writing the details of her life because she had a wonderful childhood. She wanted to remember those great details of her childhood and didn't want to forget them. So she started writing them down. But chronologically, as she was moving through her life, it came upon the years of the Holocaust, and she just kept writing, and she wrote all of the details. She also heard on the radio, which she listened to when she first came to this country, television and radio, and that's how she learned how to speak English. She remembered a talk show host once saying, "If you have a problem, if you have something that's bothering you, just take a pen and paper and write it down. Get it out, write it down." And that's what she did. So I wanted to share with you a little about her early years. So I use the slides or something similar to it when we talk with middle school and other school children, just to show them that, here we are somewhere in the US and there's Europe. And so my mom's story, it might seem when you learn about the Holocaust or learn about World War II that it happened a long time ago, far away, but it's not that far, and actually it wasn't that long ago. So this is Romania, where my mom was from, as it's situated in Europe. And here's a more close-up map of Romania. It's about the size of the state of Oregon. Up here where the river bends, there's a little town. It's not even listed on the map. It's pretty small. It was called Sighet, Romania. And if you look at the surrounding countries, there's Hungary to the west, Bulgaria to the south. Depending upon how the borders went, and they did go back and forth around the time that my mother was born and before, sometimes the area where Sighet was in Hungary, and sometimes it was Romanian. So sometimes they spoke Hungarian, sometimes they spoke Romanian. My mom's first language is actually Hungarian, although she spoke Romanian as well. She also took French, and she took some private English lessons at home. And if the name Sighet, Romania sounds familiar, you may or may not know this. Have you heard of Elie Wiesel? He was an author also, and a Holocaust survivor and a Nobel laureate. He really became a spokesperson for Holocaust survivors worldwide. Well, he was born in Sighet, Romania as well. And many middle school and high school students read Night by Elie Wiesel. And my mom always used to get the question, oh, did you know Elie Wiesel? And my mom used to say, Elie? Oh yeah, he was the scrawny little brother of a girlfriend of mine. He lived down the street. His home has been converted to a museum now, but his house is still there. And actually my mom's house is still there as well. And this was the theater, is the theater in her town. Her town was sometimes called the Little Paris, because even though it was small, and this was in the 20s when she was growing up there, it was kind of fancy. They had very nice shops. This was the theater building. It's still there today. And I actually had the amazing opportunity to visit there with my mother and my 3 sisters. We went back 50 years after my mom was liberated from the concentration camp, and we filmed a documentary. And while we were there visiting right here in the square, a woman came up about my mom's same age, and they began talking to each other, and the woman in Hungarian said, I remember you. It had been 50 years since they'd seen each other. But my mother was a teenager at the time that she left, but this woman somehow recognized her. And the woman said, yeah, I wondered what happened to the Jews in our town. Didn't know. And it was an amazing reunion, an amazing experience being there. This is the same movie theater in the background when my mom was a little girl. That's her parents and her brother Ozzy. She had one other older brother. He was already in medical school at the Sorbonne in France, in Paris. So he wasn't there for this particular picture. But my mother had a wonderful childhood. She would describe being so happy going to school. She loved dancing, music. She took piano lessons. She loved singing. She had a beautiful voice. And she just had a great, great childhood. Her parents never talked to her about world problems. Of course, they didn't have TV and news to watch, but her parents, even though they were informed, they kind of protected her as she was growing up. She just had a great time with her friends and with her music. And when she got a little bit older as a teenager, so they didn't have telephones, right? They didn't have phones to text. They didn't have internet, obviously. Yet they wanted to do what all teens want to do, and that's socialize. And so after dinner, they would get together. There's my mom in the middle and her two girlfriends, and they would go and walk on the sides, the sidewalks on the street where I just showed you near the movie theater, this downtown area. There were shops and restaurants and wonderful places to go and to see and be seen. In fact, she said she always dressed up to go on these walks because you never knew who you were going to see. You might see the boy that you had a crush on, or he might see you. And so they always dressed up, and she really loved those days. And what happened was now from the 20s to the 30s, now she's in her teenage years, still going to school, but these very strange rules started happening. And they were like these laws that were coming out. They were very odd. For example, one day there was a rule that said that Jewish shop owners could not own businesses anymore. They had to close up their shops. Well, her dad, my mom's dad, owned like a delicatessen, and he imported cheese from Paris and around, and he actually gave space to the local Sinti and Roma, then they called it Gypsy population. And not many people were very kind to that population, but he let them sell their wares in his shop. And I wish we had more time, but I have some funny stories that we've learned later about my mom's family's interaction with the Roma population. But when he found out that he couldn't own a shop anymore, that was tragic. I mean, think about it. You're the dad of the family. Back then, you were the major breadwinner, the earner to support your family. He couldn't take it. He had so much stress. He had a heart attack and died during that time. But they went on, and more rules started coming out. Another a rule came one day that said Jewish girls could no longer be educated. They could not go to school anymore. Well, that was a shock, but my mother used to say, I wasn't the best student anyway, so I said, that's okay. I'll just stay home and practice my piano, have her private English lessons, and just wait for my friends to come home, and then we would go on our walks after school, after dinner. And then another rule came, and it said Jewish people can no longer walk on the sidewalks. They have to walk in the streets. Now, one thing I didn't mention, this was the 20s and the 30s, in a very small town in Romania. There weren't cars. It was such a small town, you could walk anywhere you needed to get to, or take a horse and carriage. There were horses. In fact, my sister just visited Sighet a few years ago, and she said there's still horses and delivering things because it's just small and quaint. Well, like I would tell the kids when I speak to them in classrooms today, when you have horses in the street, what else do you have in the street? Well, you have poop, and the streets were not clean. And so my mom, dressing up for these walks, said, I don't want to get my shoes dirty. I don't want my clothes dirty. So she stopped going on the walks. Another rule came. All the Jewish people who live in this part of the town, you have to pick up and move. Don't take very much, just whatever you can carry. You have to move into this part of the town. And my mom's house was in this part of the town. And so people came and moved into her, not only part of the town, they moved into, some families moved into her house. Some strange people, she didn't know, 2, 3 families all living in her house. And they called this part of town, you weren't free to come and go. Once you were there, you had to stay there. They called that part of town the ghetto. And there was one time, and if you read Elie Wiesel's book, Night, he talks about this incident as well. There was one time when the boys and the men one day were taken, and they didn't see him again. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know where they were taken. But one time, one boy escaped and came back. And he came into their town. He snuck into the ghetto. And he said, you would not believe it. They took us and lined us up against a giant trench, and they shot us in the back. And people just fell dead into the trench. He somehow miraculously did not get shot. He miraculously escaped somehow, came back and told them. And you know what they said? They said, we don't believe you. Just like he said, you're not going to believe it. They didn't believe him. Why? This was so unprecedented. They didn't have, you have to remember, this was such a different time back then. They didn't have the movies that we have. They didn't have guns. Nobody owned a gun. There just wasn't this kind of shooting that happened. And for what purpose? These people have not done anything wrong. This was unheard of. So they didn't believe him. Time went on, but then one day, a very loud, very angry knock came on the door, and an angry voice yelled at them, get out on the street and line up in rows of 5. Okay, now you're left, because the boys and the men were gone out of town. Who's left? Elderly, young children, and women, and anyone who was too sick to have gone before, if they were in hospitals or whatever. And you were told you had to line up and get out into the street. You don't know where you're going. You don't know how long you're going to be gone. I mean, just think about it. What would you take? What would you bring with you? If you're a kid, would you bring your teddy bear? If you're, an adult, do you bring your valuable? What kind of clothes? You don't know. You just don't know. And my mom described getting out, lining up, and walking down the streets past all of her familiar places that she loved and adored growing up there. And she said it was a very sad sight to see all these old people, women, moms, scared to death, crying, didn't know where they were going. And the pace picked up, and pretty soon they felt as though they were being chased. And they were going quickly. They ended up in the train station. Now, my mom, when she was younger, in those beautiful days when she was growing up in her early childhood, her family and she would take the train to Budapest or Bucharest or some wonderful vacation, fancy places. The trains were quite nice. If you have had an opportunity to travel in European trains, quite nice. And this was not that kind of train. These trains were actually cattle cars, and they had just finished delivering cattle, so they smelled. And there were no seats inside. They were, it was dark inside with a little window at the top that let in a little bit of light, and they crammed people in. She said it was very tough because they crammed people in, no place to sit, and those trains rolled for 3 days and 2 nights. And truly, there was no food, no water, no bathrooms. You know, if they were trying to have some semblance of decency, they would hold a blanket up or a jacket, and somehow somebody had a bucket, or there was a bucket on there, but that was about it. My mom was there when she was told to leave the house. She did so with her mother and 2 little cousins that they were taking care of, because their mom, my mom's Auntie Sarah, was in the hospital, something like a hysterectomy, and couldn't come at that time. And so those 3 days and 2 nights, no food, no water, nothing. One of the things that my mom's mom brought was a loaf of bread that they just finished baking. And during those 3 days, those 2 little cousins munched up all the bread. Of course, they gave them the bread, and my mom didn't have anything. And she said, truly, some of the older, frail people died during that train ride. They didn't know where they were going. It was very scary. And on that 3rd day, the trains stopped rolling and the doors opened up, and my mom described it as just blinding light, because they haven't seen light for 3 days. And where they were, an angry soldier yelled at them from on the platform and said, "You have just arrived to Auschwitz concentration camp, and this is a work camp." And when my mom heard the word work, she thought, you know, she was a teenager by then. Actually, she was in her early 20s by then. And she thought, okay, if this is a work camp, I'm going to work. I'm going to work to survive, because what she said was what her mother always told her: when you are 21, not more than 23 years old, you are supposed to get married and start having a family. She loved children. She loved that idea. Well, she was 21 years old now, and she said, okay, then I am going to work. Well, they got off the train, and they had to, again, form these long lines, 5 abreast. It was always 5 abreast, long lines of people who had been, you know, on these trains. And there were just rows and rows, trains just coming in around the clock. But she had to get in these long lines, and they made their way up toward a platform. There was a man, it was a wooden structure, and there was a man standing up there, and he had a uniform on. And my mom said he was handsome. And so she was a little bit put at ease, thinking, oh, well, he's handsome. This can't be so bad. He's not going to be mean. Well, this man didn't say a word. He just pointed, and he was telling people to go one to the right or to the left. When my mom and her mom and the 2 little cousins came up to the front of the row underneath this platform, this man pointed to my mom's mom and the 2 little cousins, pointed them to go to the left, pointed to my mom and told her to go to the right. Well, she wanted to stay with her mom and the 2 little cousins. So she started to walk with them, and a soldier on the ground with a bayonet, you know, the knife on the end of the gun, put it under her neck and scared her half to death, and said, and because she dared to disobey this person. And so she got scared and went to the right. We know now that that person standing up on the platform was the infamous Dr. Mengele. And he is the one who we know, again, through historical evidence, that among many other atrocities that he committed, he performed experiments on humans, especially on twins. And they were just terrible. And if you take the city training for to be a researcher, if you are doing research with people, especially a protected class people, you will learn about this early beginning of our governments required training now for ethics in ethical research with humans. And it came in part due to these medical experiments that came out of the Holocaust. So when my mom was told to go to the right, she went through some gates. Now, these gates are the gates, but this photo was taken 50 years after her liberation. If you can see off in the distance, you see rows and rows of these chimneys. Those chimneys were actually from barracks, wooden barracks that are no longer standing in this part of the women's camp in Auschwitz. It was called Birkenau. And the men's camp is preserved even today. It's a museum, but here there's very little of the women's camp left. But she described coming through these gates and then going to her left, there was a wooden barrack. She went in there and there were girls in there who met them with scissors and they cut their hair off. And they, my mom described, looking down at her beautiful brown curls were down on the floor. And she said, you know what, I'll make more. I'll grow more. So she didn't let it get her down. They took her clothes. They threw back in return a very scratchy gray, almost like gunny sack dress. It looked horrible, but all the girls looked the same now with shaved heads and these dresses. And they had to go into another barrack where they met other girls who were who kept in the same group. And they were all scared. They had these bunk beds with nothing comfortable, just wooden. And she just quickly, scurried into one of those bunk beds where there's 5 or 6 girls that had to squeeze into one bunk. They slept kind of feet to feet as they had to squeeze in there. But she decided early on in her experience that she had such a beautiful life that growing up until this point, that no matter what happened to her, she would have those beautiful memories. And what she didn't know was that she was really building a cocoon around her beautiful, early, loving childhood. And those wonderful memories were going to help her as they went through what was to come. So the woman who was in charge of that bunk, her name was Giska, and she was angry and yelling at these girls and was marching up and down the aisles and barking orders at them and complaining and said, you don't know how good you have it. You were home in your comfortable beds all these years of the war. I've been here this whole time. The year was 1944. And she had been there for a few years already. She said, we had to build these barracks and now here you come. I've been here this whole time. And she was just mad and yelling and yelling. And one of the girls from my mom's hometown who had been on the train, on the cattle cars with them, said, excuse me, do you have a brother named David? And this woman said, well, why, yes, I do. Why do you ask? I don't know how this connection was made, but my mom's friend said, you look a lot like your brother. And your brother was so nice. He was in the military. And when he came through our town, we offered him food and lodging at our house. And he was so nice before he went on to the Russian front. And from that point forward, Giska became what my mom called was their guardian angel. When the Nazis came to say, it's time for work, hard labor. We have to get these girls out of the cabin. Giska said, nope, not these. We are in quarantine. These girls were sick. They weren't really sick, but she just said that to say that they were in quarantine and they couldn't go to work. And this went on for a long time. Now, during this time, they just sat around day after day after day. They weren't free to get up and walk around. They couldn't just go outside anytime, but only certain times, and those were called roll call. They had to get out, line up in rows of 5 and be counted. And during one of those times they were out there, they called for, are there any girls among you who are artists? And a few girls raised their hand. My mom didn't. And they gave them pins for tattoos, and they made them tattoo all the other girls, and gave them a number. And my mom said from that point forward, she lost her name. She was only a number. And they had roll call 3 times a day. And sometimes they would call them out in the early morning to line up, and they'd have to stand there for hours and hours and hours. It wasn't until noon, when the sun was so hot on their bald heads, the Nazis would come and count them. But this was the routine. They also were not given much food, and they were certainly not given much water. And my mom was small to begin with, and she started to lose a lot of weight. And Giska used to say, don't ever let anybody know if you're sick. Don't ever tell anybody if you're sick, because if you are, you will end up in those chimneys, in that smoke over there. And she pointed to this tall chimney, constantly smoking. And my mom, her friends, didn't know what she was talking about. What do you mean you go up in the smoke? They didn't know, but they knew it was very dangerous to get sick. Now, you couldn't go outside anytime you wanted to. You couldn't even go to the bathroom if you needed to, unless there was enough women who needed to go. Then they put them all together and they took them to the bathroom. This is the bathroom, again, 50 years after we visited. So part of it's broken down, but my mom said, no, it looked pretty much like this back then. On the wall in German, it says something to the equivalent of, remain silent or keep calm, something like that. But these were the toilets. So you just sit on the rim, you go to the bathroom, you better not have diarrhea. Somebody will find out. I mean, it was really, really, it was dangerous. My mom described losing lots and lots of weight. She was in the Auschwitz concentration camp for about 9 months. And there were times when, in her book, she describes these amazing, I guess, miraculous experiences that she had with just having to find out a way to save herself. So here was one. Once in a while, when they had these roll calls, there were these special roll calls called selections. And if you were too skinny, if you lost too much weight, if you weren't able to work, that kind of thing, you would get selected, and those girls were never seen again. And my mom was called to selection, and she was in line, and there were 2 Nazis, and you had to walk naked in between them, and they would check to see how skinny you were, and either you could stay or you get selected. And obviously we know now that they were killed. Well, my mom knew she was at great risk, tiny little skinny legs at that point. But there was a new arrival that had come, and there were 2 twin girls, and they were still quite a lot of meat on their bones, so to speak. My mom would describe them as being pretty voluptuous. And so as they were walking between, the first girl started past the first Nazi and over to the second one, my mom said, "Can I walk between the two of you to the two sisters?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure. Okay." And so the first girl started going, and the men who were checking them out were quite distracted by the first girl. And my mom, as soon as that second nice looking girl started coming, my mom just scurried with her little skinny legs and wasn't seen. And she saved herself that way. She goes, "I don't know how I came up with that, but I did." At one point, though, they came to take them to go to work, and their guardian angel, Giza, could not protect them any longer. And what they had to do was walk from one part of the campus, a very long walk. I've seen it. I've seen the maps of it, to another part of the camps where they had to walk in between these electrical barbed wire fences that if you touched, you would die instantly. Here, 50 years later, she's not touching she couldn't bring herself to touch it, even though it's obviously not electrified now. But she said she did see girls who just gave up. They did not want to live anymore. They did not want to be in these horrible conditions anymore. They did not want to live in fear anymore. They touched the fence. They were scorched instantly to death. But her job was in this building where, do you remember at the beginning when she had to take her dress and have it exchanged for that other uniform? Well, they would take all of the clothes, all of the eyeglasses, all of the shoes, the items that people brought, millions and millions of people, and they would collect them and put them in these warehouses. And one of her jobs was to take, they were given very dull scissors, and they had to take the clothing and cut through strips, cut through the clothing to make strips of clothes, of fabric that they braided and then rolled up into balls. And they were told that the Nazis were using those in the German military as fuses to light the bombs. And so one day they were at work, and one of the girls from her barracks started to scream and cry. And everyone said, what is it? And this girl said, "These are Giska's clothing." She got discovered that she had been protecting this group of girls from not having to go to work for many, many weeks. And she got killed because of it. And that was really scary. Here's a picture of the shoes that go all the way up to the ceiling. This is actual photo that we took in Auschwitz, the men's side that they've now turned into a museum, and the shoes go from the floor to this. You can see the ceiling up there. It was just crazy. So they were scared at this point, and now they started to really by then put things together. And my mom figured that out, that once you were, somebody was killed, they then they were put in ovens and burned. And that's why they so-called one had the smoke with these chimneys constantly burning. And there were several of them at her particular camp. This was one in the men's side that they had preserved in the museum. And she was, I remember this, I said, "Mom, what are you thinking about?" And she said, "I don't know which one of these ovens it could have been that her mother and the two little cousins were killed." But time went on. Now it was December 1944, near the end of the war. One day they got an order that said, "Get up, line up. You are going to be leaving Auschwitz concentration camp." They left those gates that say Arbeit macht frei, the work makes free, those famous gates of Auschwitz. They got to walk out of there, but they had to stay in these rows, and they were taken, and they had to walk over days. And this was again a 3-day, 2-night first a walk and then again a train ride. But if you couldn't keep up on the walk, there was snow on the ground. She said she hardly had any shoe soles left, and just that flimsy dress, no food, no water. But they walked them through countrysides, farms, farmhouses, and this is what was called the Death March. And Frank and her sister, Corrie ten Boom, others were on this death march. And if you couldn't keep up with the pace, you were shot. And my mom was very small, very skinny at that point, but she talks about in her book ways that she kind of tricked herself into not getting shot. Well, at one point they got onto trains and then took them to another concentration camp, and that was called Bergen-Belsen, and that was deep in Germany. What was happening was the Russians were about to liberate the Auschwitz concentration camp, and the Nazis did not want to leave any evidence, any people who were alive. So whoever could walk, they marched them on this death march, to get them deeper into Germany, because Auschwitz is in Poland, and they had concentration camps in all over Poland and in other countries. But near the end of the war, they centralized whoever was still alive. They were shipping them by train, and these marches to Germany, deep in Germany, into Auschwitz concentration camp. And so my mom described that camp. Now, they really didn't have any much food at all. She was in a barrack again. And here for a group of girls in a barrack, they would throw in, she described it sounded like a turnip, like the size of an apple, but like a vegetable. But in time, she said, they were supposed to share it, one for all those girls. They just took a bite and shared it. But she said in time she couldn't bite it because if you might know, through malnutrition, you lose your support, the bone and the gum support of your teeth. And she said her teeth were like wobbling in her head. And the girls were dying a lot. Day after day, someone would die during the night or during the day, and they would just drag them outside and start stacking them outside the window until the window was covered. And so they just kept them in the barrack, and people were dying. And she, at one point, was on the floor and lying down, and she described it as a very peaceful sleep. She was falling asleep. She said nothing hurt. Suddenly, nothing hurt. She was, for some reason, at peace, and she was resting with her eyes closed, maybe fading in and out, and wondered to herself, I wonder if this is how we die. She was okay. Nothing hurt. She was at peace. And then she heard yelling and running and shooting, and a man opened up the door to the barrack and poked his head in, and he had a beret on his head, but he shut the door again. And she thought to herself, who dares to wake me up from this peaceful sleep? But it was crazy, noisy, tanks, all kinds of things. And the man came back, and he spoke English. And she remembered from her private English lessons that he was speaking English. And he said, you are free. This is the end of the war. We are liberating you. It was the British. And then later, 1 week later, the Americans who came to Bergen-Belsen. And there were volunteer ambulance drivers, the American Field Service, who later started American Field Service, AFS, the largest foreign exchange student organization in the world. And they came and they liberated them. And my mom was 22 years old, and she couldn't stand. She was 22 years old and she weighed about 47 pounds. And when the ambulance drivers asked her, where do you want to go? She said, I want to go back home to Siget. And her friends said, Alice, have you seen yourself? You cannot. You have to go someplace and get well first. You can't travel like that. You have to let them take care of you and then you go back home. And so she was put in ambulances, and by then they were taking survivors all over Europe, and she was taken to Sweden, and they had converted schools into makeshift hospitals. And she said the Swedish people were so nice. And after some time, she was able to get moved into a rehabilitation place, and only women could be in there. It was a rehab place for women, almost like a hospital. And she said it took her a long time before she could even learn to walk again. She was so malnourished and so skinny, and having to come back from all of that. She said, you know what? The one thing that finally got her to get out of bed and try walking was if she could turn her head, she's lying in bed, she could turn it a certain way and look down the hall. She could look into a room at the end of the hall, and there was a piano in there. And she loved piano and she loved music, and it reminded her of the piano lessons she took when she was young. So she learned how to walk, and she got there. And she was there many, many months. And there was one man who was allowed to come in. He was a photographer, because again, they didn't have internet. They didn't have a lot of technology for reuniting people, these survivors, with their families. They took photographs of them, and the Red Cross and other agencies helped to reunite. Families were dispersed around the globe, and they would try and find each other through photographs. So he came in to take photograph. He was allowed to come in because he was a photographer and he was Jewish. And in time, he and my mom started to talk, but they didn't speak the same language. She spoke Hungarian, he spoke German. And my mother had a friend in the place who spoke both languages. And so her friend would walk between them. They would go on walks in the garden. And it was one of those evenings where he said, through the friend, to my mom, he spoke German, translated into Hungarian. He said, I think I could spend the rest of my life with her. And my mom said back through the interpreter from Hungarian to German, yeah, I think I could spend the rest of my life with him too. And that was great. And they were married in 1946. They lived in Sweden with a foster family, were wonderful, until they were able to make their way to the United States. They had to have a sponsor. My dad's brother, my dad and his brother were in Dachau concentration camp, but they were able to be released earlier. His brother had made his way to the United States, but you couldn't just go anywhere. There were only certain cities that would accept refugees. I guess we'd call them sanctuary cities. And one of them was outside of Portland, Oregon, and that's where they ended up. And they had got there, and my mom, they were married here in 46. My mom was 23 years old. She made it, she said. Because her mom told her, when you're 21, not more than 23, you're supposed to get married and start raising a family. And they moved to the Pacific Northwest in 1948. And my first sister was born in 1950. My mother was told by the doctors at the time that she would not be able to have children. And she went on to have 4 girls. I'm the youngest one. Interesting note, she of course lost all of her teeth because of the malnutrition, and she had her dentures made at the dental school in Portland. 50 years after her liberation, she went back. She decided to go back, and I said, I'm going with you. And all my other sisters said, we're going with you. We knew this was a big deal. So we had a videographer who came with us. And this is a photograph inside of my mom's favorite synagogue in her hometown. Out of 2,000 people, Jewish people who were taken from Siget, 200 returned. And one of them, we found my mom's piano teacher. And we had the best party. She was playing, we were dancing. It was wonderful. But we also retraced her steps to the concentration camps that she was taken in. This was the one in Bergen-Belsen. There are no buildings remaining because they had to burn them because of disease, typhus and others. But you can see that low raised area in the background, that's a mass grave. They have mass graves all over there because of the number of people who died. And the inscription on this particular monument said, Israel and the world shall remember 30,000 Jews who were exterminated there in Bergen-Belsen. So my mom, she credited my dad, and he would say, you can't live with hate and anger. You have to let go of that anger and hate, because that will chew you up inside. That'll tear you up. That'll eat you up inside if you carry that anger. And so she really took that to heart. She was an optimist, and she raised us, her 4 little girls, as just normal American. You know, we regret that she never taught us her language. Some of her recipes, yes, but not many. She wanted us to blend in like everyone else. But when it came time, over the years, she decided to gather the Holocaust survivors in the Portland area, and there were quite a number. And also, she had retired to my dad retired to Palm Springs, California, Southern California. She did the same thing there, and she gathered the Holocaust survivors. And I was there at their first meeting. It was amazing. But she said, we are not here to cry. We are here to leave a legacy. And she was responsible for the idea of building a Holocaust memorial. This is the one in Washington Park in Portland, Oregon. That's my sister in the background with the umbrella. She was very involved. And if you go to Portland, or if you go to Palm Desert, California, you'll see the Holocaust memorials that my mom helped to organize. So we're very, very proud of her. She really came out of it and lived a very happy life, I would say, the American dream, and raised her 4 daughters. I guess if I think about it, I guess I would be considered first generation college along with my sisters. And in just wrapping up, I know that we just have a short amount of time left. I just wanted to share with you some of the lessons that I learned. I mean, truly the story, I think, is layered with so many lessons, but here's a few that I just pulled apart. My mom would say, you would be surprised how creative you can be when you know your life is in danger. She said, I just laughed at myself when I thought about running between those two twin girls that were quite voluptuous, and other stories that she talks about in her book. You just become creative in some way. Also, it was very important to focus on a goal. So even through hard times, through this experience that she had, of course, but even those of us who, just been through a pandemic, focus on a goal, move forward, always keep moving forward. That was an important lesson that she learned. She used to say, when she talked to school children and church groups and et cetera, she would say, people would say, oh, I thought my problems were bad. Oh, not compared to what you've been through. And she said, don't say that. People's problems are problems to them. You cannot compare suffering. Everybody has problems, and we need to acknowledge that. And then here's my dad's comment that she took to heart: don't live your life with hate, or that will eat you up inside. In addition, I've come to realize that, you know what, the United States has it right. When we say that all men are created equal, I would say all people are created equal. And this is in the intro to our bill, to the Declaration of Independence. We're all people. We're all equal. And for some reason, I just think it's part of human nature. We forget the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think if I could summarize in one word, if I had to pick a word, the word would be empathy. If you could empathize with others and others' predicament and put yourself in their shoes, because someday, you know, someone could come for you or target you based on whatever. And therefore, we need to be able to empathize. I think if we started from that point of being able to put yourself in someone's shoes and treating everybody equally with respect, doesn't mean you have to love everybody, but treat them with respect. For Pete's sake, we're all humans. I can't think of a problem that we wouldn't overcome if we did this. Vanessa, I know I just talked on and on, but if anybody has questions, do we have time for a few?
Absolutely. Yes.
If
Anyone
anyone,
has, go ahead.
if anyone has questions, go ahead. Either, Vanessa, do you want them to put it in the chat or to raise a hand or speak out?
Yeah, either way, or they could just unmute and ask their question.
Might not be able to answer them. I'm not a historian, but I'll certainly try.
Dr. Crain, this isn't a question, but thank you so much for sharing that story. I've been able to sit here with my kids and listen to it. And the hard part for me is in some of the more recent years, there's been certain school districts that have refused to teach the Holocaust. And I've been completely against that because it's such an important part of our history when it comes to being human and understanding the development and as you said, having the golden rule as part of your life. I feel it is so important and to have that, and these events removed, it damages so many people, and especially like your family and your mother's legacy. What a sad thing to be able to put aside because it's an ugly part of history. Well, not all history is beautiful, but listening to the story and your mother's fighting spirit and her desire to keep going, what a beautiful thing to share. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for coming in. Thank you so much for bringing your kids. Hi, kids. What is very encouraging is that there is a growing number of states who are now passing a law and requiring Holocaust to be taught in the curriculum. And so I think one thing that we can do is just continue to talk about it, continue to raise awareness. But here's the thing, continue to tie the lessons learned from the Holocaust to today and why it's important to continue teaching it in the schools. We also have wonderful museums and resources in this country, in the world, on the internet, accessible, and certainly age appropriate. We usually recommend beginning Holocaust education at the middle school level and then high school and beyond. There are some wonderful Holocaust stories that are age appropriate for younger, grade school. But the point is to do exactly what you're doing, and that's keep the stories going, keep the history alive. Why? We need to learn from history. We just don't want to repeat it for anyone.
Well, and absolutely. And I think the important thing for me in taking this away is, yes, we all have different sufferings that we encounter. But the moral of the story is, which spirit are you going to allow to live? Is it going to be the fighting spirit and the spirit of uplifting and love, or is it going to be the hate that ultimately destroys you?
Right. Roy, I'm going to add one more. There's the loving one, there's the hate one, but there's also the one who doesn't speak up. And we know from a Holocaust education that if you see something and you don't speak up, that you are lending support to the perpetrator. And so that's why I'm so happy that schools are talking about bullying. There's a huge anti-bullying campaign in school curriculum because, I mean, if you boil it down, the Holocaust was bullying to the maximum degree, right? And discrimination and all of that. And so if somebody would have spoken up and or said to Hitler, you know, you think that's a good idea? You know, wouldn't that have been nice if my mom and others didn't have to go through this, or 6 million, 12 million didn't have to be murdered? Right. You can't remain silent. And the other thing we know from Holocaust education is that just as hate can be taught or learned behavior, it can be passed down from generations and across peoples, so can a rescuer mentality. Many of you have seen Schindler's List or other movies. There were so few people. There were some who were considered righteous individuals who hid children, who helped people escape, but they were very, very few compared to the number of people who were murdered, the number of people who were perpetrators, the number of people who remained silent.
I have a question, Dr. Crain.
Yes.
If it's okay.
Yes.
You know, as you were growing up, you know, to what extent did your mom and her parenting protect you from what she'd gone through? Or to what extent did she share? Obviously, she shared a lot with you as an adult, but as you were a young child and she's recovering herself,
Yeah.
How open was she about all of this?
Yeah. It's a great question. And it was on that trip that my sisters and I took with my mom when we filmed our documentary, that we realized that between the 4 girls, and there's a big age difference. I'm the youngest by far. I might have been in an accident, I don't know. But there are 12 years between my oldest sister and me. We realized, and when my oldest sister was born, my parents had only been in this country 2 years. So we realized that we had very different experiences growing up and very different experiences with regard to the Holocaust. By the time I came, my mom talked about it a little bit more, not a lot, but a little. It wasn't until the book came out, when we read it, we were like, oh, that explains that, you know, about mom. One thing about her, and this was the way she was with the school children, high school, college, church groups, she was always very age appropriate, as she was with us growing up. There's an entire syndrome in the country of Israel, and in this country too, of children of survivors, called second generation syndrome. And Israel, because so many, you know, it was established after World War II, and so the majority of the early population were Holocaust survivors. And there's this psychology diagnosis called second generation syndrome. And I think it's because the parents would talk about it too early when the kids were young, or talk about it all the time. My mom wasn't like that. It really was much more age appropriate. In fact, when my oldest sister was a little one, but saw the numbers on my mom's arm, she said, "Mom, what are those numbers on your arm?" And my mom said, "Those? Oh, don't worry about that. That's just Hitler's phone number." She just made a joke out of it. And so I think that's how we grew up until we were old enough to really hear more of the details.
Hi, Dr. Crain. I wanted to make sure I say hello.
Hi.
It was so nice to see you today and to hear more about your story. It was very special.
Thank you for joining. Ingrid is from Baia, is that right?
Yeah.
It's a little town near Sighet, Romania. So we met just a while ago, and I think we became friends because of that.
And yeah, I'm half Hungarian, half Romanian, because as you were saying, because of the boundaries. So I was the product of some mixing. And my grandma, my Hungarian grandma, I don't know if you're familiar with Somes Ordohely. It's a small village. It's not far from Bayamare.
Okay.
And so she had, well, her mother, she shared with me this story. My great grandmother, her neighbors were a Jewish family, and she remembers hearing about how they were carted off, and it was her best friend, and it really traumatized her, my great grandmother. So there's lots of stories like that can.
My mother used to say, because she had a very special place in her heart for military, for veterans, for the people who fought in these wars. And she said, yes, every survivor has a story, but every family has a story, but every person in the military has a story too. This World War II, touched so many people, and she was really appreciative for those who fought and helped to put an end to this.
And I was curious, as far as the book, is it possible to get a copy of it somewhere? Or
yeah, thanks again. My mom never never intended to publish, so we didn't go with a publisher. But we self-published, and you can get it. One way to do it is my sisters and I made a very modest website for my mom. It's just called alicekern.com. And you can communicate to us through there, but also Amazon. You can sometimes find it, and also find used copies, because there are a lot of schools that maybe the kids had to read for school and then they were done with it and put it on Amazon. So I actually bought a couple myself that way. As our stash is dwindling down, I can sometimes find used copies at a really good price.
Oh, thank you. I'll look for it, because it would be nice to. It's like a diary from that very important time in history. So I'd like to read it.
Great. Vanessa, any other questions? Do we have time?
Yep, we have someone, Roy just commented that he was able to buy the book on eBay. So that's a little tip there for that. And I think there was one other question that came earlier, was about the title of the book.
Oh, yeah, Tapestry of Hope.
And how that came about.
Oh, thanks. So inside my mom's house, and I've been inside her house, the living room, which they call the salon, was beautiful. It didn't just have a square ceiling, it had a rounded ceiling, beautiful painted walls. And in this salon was the grand piano. And hanging above the grand piano was a tapestry that was handmade. My mom used to describe it as the talk of the town. And she could tell you in detail, and I think she does in the foreword of her book, she describes it in detail, because that tapestry was promised to her brother, who was away at medical school. When he graduated, became a doctor, their mom wanted her brother to have that tapestry hanging in his medical office. And of course, you've heard of, the fate of Nazi looting of art, and, not being reunited with the rightful owner, but there's hope. So, Tapestry of Hope.
Wow.
I was curious too then, as far as, because there were old photos, I assume they're from the book as well, or in the book. Was she able to bring those with her, or did she go back to Seagate and she was able to find her old home and the old?
This is a great question. I was hoping somebody would ask this. So think about it. You're told to leave. You don't know what to bring. What do you bring? And you weren't able to get back home. Actually, when you eventually did, someone else had moved into your house. Where's your stuff? How do you get pictures for a book, especially? Well, all those many years later, when my mom was about to have the book published, some relatives living in the United States said, hey, do you want some pictures for your book? And my mom said, yes. Well, it turns out that a mom, just like I am a mom, I constantly share photos of my son and my cats and, other things with friends around the world that I have. And that's what her mom was doing, was mailing, because they, mailed letters with photos to family and friends who were dispersed, some in this country. And when they found out my mom was writing a book, they sent her the photos. And that is the only link to her past.
Oh, wow. So she never got a hold of anything from back in Seagate. Oh,
No.
that's wonderful that she had the relatives. Yeah.
And photographs.
Yeah.
Make sure you take lots of photographs of your kids and share them.
I know. I always say we have a lot of beautiful old photos, but ever since I guess I've been in high school, everything's digital. We don't have anything printed out, and I keep meaning to, because it is more special to have.
Any other questions?
Dr. Crain, this is one for you. If you could leave a legacy like your mother for the rest of us, what would it be? What's the one thing that you would want us to take away from this that we can share?
Roy, I mean, thank you for that. And I feel like I'm trying to do my part in a very small way that my mother did so much more enormously. I mean, obviously a first person account, and her style, she was so gentle and funny, and yet she didn't pull her punches when she talked about the details. But her message, and I share this with her, she was very hopeful. She was very optimistic. No matter how bad it gets in your life, in the world, in politics, in our times, there is always hope. You need to have hope. And she felt as though the world was getting better. It was a better place because people were reaching out and helping other people. And when other genocides happened over the decades of her adult life, she saw other countries stepping up and saying, we're not going to let this happen. Unfortunately, they still are. And then when I talk to school kids, we bring it down to the level of bullying in classrooms. It still happens. So my message really would be for each of us to start within ourselves and ask, not only, wow, might I be discriminating or thinking badly about another group of people? Am I? Check in with yourself. Maybe you don't realize it, but am I not treating somebody like I would want to be treated? And then the second question like that is, am I keeping quiet if I know that there are other groups that are being treated poorly? What might I be able to do in my one small way? What could I do in my circle to not lend support to perpetrators and be a part of the solution and treat people the way you would want to be treated?
Well, I am sure your mother must have been incredibly proud of you, and the apple does not fall far from the tree as it relates to kindness and tenacity and hopefulness. So I am just so touched and grateful, Dr. Crain, that you were able to present and share the story with us tonight. As we wrap up, I just want to see if there are any other final questions. Okay.
Great.
Well, thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you at future Neighborhood Health Series events. Thank you, Dr. Crain, for being with us. An incredible, incredible evening. Thank you so much, and be well, everyone. Good night.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.